we're going to go straight into our next session, which is with Lucia Pietroiusti. And Lucia couldn't make it today, so she's beaming in live from London. Hi, Lucia. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry not to be next to you.
Not at all. It's a real pleasure. Again, I'm going to keep the introductory remarks very, very brief because, in a sense, the conversation will flesh that out. But Lucia is a curator and founder of General Ecology at the Serpentine Galleries. And she is somebody that I've known also for a sort of decent amount of time, particularly working with our friend and colleague Hans-Ulrich Obrist, but whose work, research, investigation, questioning, passion as well has for many, many years taken broadly the topic of the environment, of ecology, and all the kind of derivative ways in which we now we discuss that, whether it's the climate crisis, climate grief, or indeed climate justice. And the question of language is something that I would like to talk to Lucia about. But just to get things started off, Lucia, Brendan just mentioned that that Dubai has not had the luxury of pleasant weather that it has now is being forced to lose, as it were, whereas in certain parts of Europe, particularly, one does feel the kind of oncoming extremization of, particularly of temperature. But what is your favorite weather?
I'm reminded of, do you remember the song Emotional Weather Report by Tom Waits?
Mm-hmm.
The extended outlook for an indefinite period of time until you come back to me, baby, is high tonight, low tomorrow, and precipitation is expected. What I mean by that, Shimon, is that I really connect weather to something very, very intimate to do with home, and to do with love, and to do with sort of the body grounding itself and feeling a particular way. So, I mean, I have a favorite weather. It's the weather of Italy, where I grew up. And it goes with the smell of sage and the smell of fennel in the dry and the dry grass.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the crucial thing about that is I've been living in incredibly damp countries for 20 years now, and my body feels damp and uncomfortable. So I think it's more the question, one's favorite weather is also to a certain extent the weather of home, harsh as it may be. Then of course the extremization, I mean, I'm not talking about climate breakdown here, because obviously as places become unlivable, then the question of home reemerges in a completely different way, of course.
And on that question of weather, you are now synonymous with the opera Sun and Sea, which maybe many of our audience would have seen either at the Venice Biennial in 2019, where it won the Golden Lion, or in countless other venues. It seems to be on an incredible non-stop world tour. Maybe it's the first kind of ambient climate that is on a world tour. I wonder if you could quite briefly, Lucia, describe what people see and hear when they visit Sun and Sea, and also what are some of the most moving and surprising things that you've heard about this performance from all these varied audiences from continents around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, the first thing that I will say is that Sun and Sea is the work of 3 artists from Lithuania, Rugi Kvarciukaitė, Vaiva Granite, and Lina Laplytė. And I was just fortunate enough to be the curator of the Venice iteration and to continue to be the curator on its tour. And there are some things that don't change about Sun and Sea, which I guess is what I'll describe to you. What doesn't change is that as an audience member, you walk into what seems to be a kind of infinite performance, an infinite opera. The singing never stops. You never clap. You never come in. You always come in mid-song. What it really is actually is a 1-hour loop, of course, that continues. And what you see down below you, about 4 or 5 meters below you, is a beach, as you might do if you were hovering sort of 5-6 meters above a beach. with sand and bathing suits and kids and, plastic balls and all kinds of badminton and whatever you might find, dogs, whatever you might find on the beach. And some of the characters on this beach who are seemingly doing, and in fact, the stage direction asked them to do whatever they would normally do on holidays on a sunny, hot day. Some of the characters on the beach are singers, and those singers sort of open up over the course of a number of songs and choruses, a number of sort of thoughts of the everyday conversation, things that appear almost meaningless in the way that you'd experience them on holidays, but that in fact belie or somehow hide some kind of pre-perception, not quite exactly perception, but sort of pre-perception of some indications of some kind of looming climate breakdown, pollution, and so on. And so someone might notice the way that jellyfish are swirling around with plastic bags. There's a song that is sort of tackling kind of techno optimism head on and with a certain degree of sarcasm and so on. And so to get to the second half of your question, I think one of the things that I find the most moving about following a piece, not just sort of being the curator of one version of it, but actually following it as it sort of traverses space, but also importantly time, is the way that the interpretation of it changes as you change those spaces, and the way that the piece also adapts to it. So and I think it also goes with a sort of personal growth in learning to read the piece in different ways, right? So when it was presented in Venice, I remember talking so much about the piece putting on stage or sort of dramatizing the fact that climate breakdown is this hyper object that we can't conceive of, and it's larger than a human brain and so on. And obviously, as you move the piece around and start to talk about it with people, that's not actually true at all. Like if you're on the front lines of climate breakdown, it's not a hyper object, it's an incredibly material thing. It moves your house, it moves your family, it moves you, it destroys your livelihood. And so the piece remains more or less the same. We adapted for local contexts that try and bring in some issues around sort of particularly environmental justice, but the piece remains broadly the same, but the way that the piece is received changes a lot. Not to mention the fact that during the COVID pandemic, we had a few quite sort of sad, actually, performances where there was, audience members were like 1 and then 2 meters and then 1. Very, very empty, quite sort of sad. And then what came up in the piece was the fact that this was an outdoor scene being staged indoors. So there all of a sudden the lockdown sort of was mirrored in the place. And then we've shown it in abandoned Bauhaus swimming pools and in Baroque theaters and in abandoned car parks. And every time the piece sort of continues to be this projection of the audience and the times somehow. So I must have heard it about 250 times, and I'm not at all tired of it myself.
I mean, there would be an interesting way to relate it to kind of generative art, where, we have computational code or algorithms that produce these like never repeating configurations, so there's something generative and infinitely iterative, I think, about. Because also the thing is, when you go, I mean, it's just the nature of how human attention works, right? So, I mean, you can either try and take in the whole thing, but you tend to sort of zoom in to specific characters, and obviously when you zoom into one specific character, you're not seeing the others. So, you could go back obviously every day and then just focus. I mean, you could do that, the great Zidane thing, no? The Douglas Gordon, Philippe Parano thing, where you just focus on the face of one person, but on a different day every week. But you mentioned
just on that, Shimon, just on the generative thing. I remember once wanting to do an event. I don't know. I always come up with the title first and then try and figure out what it is. Like a very Borgesian event called "A Machine as Complex as the World Itself," and obviously the underlying thing is like a machine as complex as the world itself can only be the world. So I'm quite interested in the way of like, how do you make a complex advanced technology through the most DIY? Like you just put a kid on stage and all of a sudden you've got, a self-generating artwork that just changes,
Yeah.
So that's something that I've thought about quite, humorously in relation to technology in this piece as well.
We now know what your next show is going to be. Your son on a stage.
That's my life.
I mentioned language, and I wanted to ask you, how important is language in tackling the environmental crisis?
Right. So it's a tough one, that one, because I personally tend to be quite careful about some of the words that I use. Like I never about nature, because what is that, and all the history of sort of natural national parks and all that, talking about the climate change as opposed to breakdown and so on. So I tend to be quite careful about which words I choose to use, but I, to a certain extent, am careful about them because I don't want to get into an argument that is simply about language. Like, I'm careful about language in order to then just be able to bypass it sort of as far as possible. There is a question of translation that is, I think, more interesting than language itself, in that as soon as you bring together different disciplines around something really complex like climate breakdown, and you need, your theologian and your archaeobotanist and what have you, but they all mean, like, the word significant means something different for a statistician and for a politician and for an artist and for a science. All of these words mean completely different things. And so you spend quite a lot of time in that kind of mediation pattern of trying to figure out, not so much how can we agree on which word to use, but how can we sort of collectively bring to the table what we mean when we use those kinds of words. I think that's quite crucial.
Thank you. And so I inferred this in my introduction, that I tend to refer to myself as a melancholic realist, which is a way of escaping, I think, the binary of being an optimist or a pessimist. I wanted to ask you, Lucia, having been immersed yourself in all things ecology for several years now, and indeed privy to the insights of really some of the world's brightest minds who have been thinking extremely deeply on this topic, where do you find yourself now on this spectrum of optimism to pessimism?
I mean, I kind of tend to agree with the notion, I think Brendan raised this before, the notion that at any rate, nihilism should be out, right? I mean, that's just for sure nothing good is going to happen, right? Or nothing can be repaired, or nothing. That's just
Yeah.
That's the for sure no-go. So given that, I also don't particularly feel like being an optimist is a particularly helpful position, given that I'm in London, which is not as threatened by climate breakdown and so on. And so, but what I like about my job so much is that the role is not so much to make a statement about whether things are going to be all good, all bad, or a little bit of the two, but it's more about being sensitive. So I think the answer to your question is, I try and be as sensitive to that kind of medium or matrix between us, which includes sort of the behaviors of the planet and us as part of it. I try and just be sensitive about it. And then to a certain extent, my position around the optimism, pessimism spectrum becomes somewhat irrelevant.
I mean, that ties back to the language question from before as well, no? Or language translation. Lucia, my last question to you is, do you have a favorite disaster movie?
I'll just tell you that I really liked, I mean, I could tell you that I love The Last of Us because I'm a gamer and I love that adaptation. The way that you can make an adaptation of a zombie apocalypse through the kind of strange behavior of mycelium, and then the series is incredibly soulful, I found. But I think the film that I would want to mention is Strange World, the new Disney. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't. Tell us about it.
I mean, I want to give the plot away, but I fear that I would ruin it for everyone. But it really takes on, and it's interesting when sort of mass culture, when Disney takes it on, you feel a bit weird about it. But it takes on Gaia. It takes on interior multitude, and it also has the end of it particularly as a nod to an Iroquois cosmogony. So I just thought, somehow, I don't know why and how, but they somehow managed to catch something of the sort of shifting paradigms. And I think when those kinds of big studios do something like that, it's important to listen out for it, try and figure out what it means.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. Lucia, thank you for dropping in with us today. I am grateful to the gods of technology and internet cables that this has gone extremely smoothly. I hope I don't jinx anything. Will you please join me in thanking Lucia Pietroiusti? Thank you, Lucia. Bye.